Well, good morning, everybody. Nice to see you here. Nice to see everybody who's joining us on Zoom. Now, the Apostle Paul, as we've been studying in the last few months and weeks particularly, got himself into real difficulties on a journey because the journey went wrong. Ever been on a journey that went wrong? Ever got in a car with some friends or your family and you're heading to an event or you're going on holiday and you hit the motorway and there's been a pile-up 10 miles up the road? And then your choice is gridlock for a few hours or taking that next junction off and going down the B roads, and then you find that everybody else has done the same thing. And you end up arriving at your destination 4 hours late, and if you've got children in the car, they're as frazzled as they can be, and if you've got friends in the car, they've fallen out, you miss the event, you're late for your holiday, and you're utterly frustrated. Anyone have had that feeling? Journeys sometimes go wrong. Paul had a simple idea: I'll go to Jerusalem, I'll drop off some financial gifts, I'll greet the church, I'll pay my respects at the temple, then I'm going off to Rome. But it didn't happen that way. He arrived at Rome, as we shall find out shortly, 2 years late. We'll find out why today. Journeys that go wrong are very problematical. A couple of years ago, I was visiting somebody in the church, and I came home on my bicycle from that visit. And I told my wife I'd be at home at a certain time, and I took a side road. And as I went down this side road, in front of me as I was cycling along this side road, not far from here, I saw a car in the hedge, on fire, it appeared to me, with the engine revving. And as I cycled up to this car, there was a man leaning in the passenger window, and there was a woman slumped over the driving wheel. And I was trying to get home for the time I'd said to my wife, and the bloke said to me, "Call the ambulance, mate." So I stopped and called the ambulance, and I suddenly found I was in the middle of a major incident. The woman had had a heart attack and had driven into the hedge, and managed to get her foot off the brake so that the engine cooled down and stopped revving, and it wasn't really a fire, it was just the smoke of the tires on the road. And I called the ambulance and described the situation to them, and they said, "Yeah, we'll be right with you." And I stood on the side of the road looking nervous, not knowing what was going to happen next. Another guy came up, said, "I know about first aid," got the lady out on the road, put her in the right position to keep her airways open and all the rest of it. And I'm just standing there, and the guy on the other end of the phone saying, "Stay on the line, mate. I need to talk to you until the ambulance arrives." So I'm watching all this going on. She's still alive. There's hope. Then one ambulance arrived. Then another ambulance arrived. Then a fire engine arrived. Then another fire engine arrived. Then they closed the main road, and I thought, this is all down to me. I made the phone call. And they thought they need the fire brigade as well because I said there was a fire in the engine. So the whole situation came to an absolute stop. And eventually the paramedics did a great work with this lady, rushed her off to hospital, the incident ended, and I went home an hour late. Not every journey works out exactly as you want, but I heard later that her life had been saved. Not every journey works out as you intended. And Paul had this dramatic experience that we've seen in the last few weeks, that a very simple task: I'm going to give some financial gifts to the church, I'm going to greet the church and encourage them, I'm going to pay my respects in the temple and go in quietly, I'm not going to cause a scene in Jerusalem where we know there's opposition to the Christian message. It all went wrong. And if you've been here the last few weeks, you'll know what went wrong. There was opposition, rioting, attempted murder, military intervention, speeches, denunciations, imprisonment, a vision, a plot to assassinate him. God, you could put this in a thriller, couldn't you? And that's just the last few weeks in our preaching. And then, finally, the military guy in Jerusalem says, I've had enough of this. I'm sending him off to the governor, the boss, the leader of the province, the procurator, the representative of the emperor. Governor Felix, we'll send it to him. We'll send this man to him. And as Maggie explained very eloquently last week, of course, they sent hundreds of soldiers with Paul on this 2-day journey, only about 70 miles, in order that he wasn't kidnapped on the way and assassinated. And so we ended our last episode with Paul having been taken away from Jerusalem, now taken to what was in effect the capital city of the country, a town called Caesarea, and he's been put in prison there, awaiting a hearing and a trial. Now, Caesarea is as different from Jerusalem as you can get. Jerusalem is a hotbed of political intrigue and religious fervor and ethnic tension, and it's a very close-knit city with people packed together, and people come there in large numbers for different festivals. That's over there. But Caesarea is a Roman town planted in Judea. The Romans built it all up. It's on the sea. I've been there. It's an amazing place. It's on the sea, a beautiful Mediterranean view. Lots of Roman architecture. Lots of lovely Roman temples, an amphitheater, a beautiful aqueduct bringing the water down from the nearby Mount Carmel straight into this dry city, a beautiful port. You can go straight to Rome by ship from there, and that's where the governor lived. Peaceful, calm, the military headquarters, full of soldiers, full of administrators. You could hear Latin spoken on the street rather than the Aramaic of the Jews. This was a calm, peaceful place. This is where the governor lived. Safe from all the tumult of this difficult and awkward country, Judea, with these complicated religious people who the Romans never really understood. This is Caesarea. And in the middle of Caesarea, you can still go to the ruins today, which I've walked through, is a huge palace where the governor lived with a beautiful sea view, lovely breeze coming in from the Mediterranean, and a little prison there for any prisoners. So Paul is now in prison in what was known as Herod's palace, because he was the man who built the palace. To get the general scene, we've moved from the hothouse city to the calm Roman city where everything's under control. Now, when you go to Caesarea today, you can see a little inscription that the archaeologists have discovered with the name Pontius Pilate on it. Does that ring a few bells? Pontius Pilate, the previous governor, who lived in the same palace that this governor lived in, who also disliked going down to Jerusalem, but one day he got caught up in a really tricky situation because a man called Jesus of Nazareth was brought to him early in the morning on a Saturday morning. And he had to make a quick judicial decision, are we going to execute this man or not? And he decided to execute him, and so he became a notorious participant in the death of Jesus. Well, this man lived in the same house that Paul is now imprisoned in over 20 years later, where a man called Governor Felix is now the ruler. Now, Governor Felix had been around in the country for a few years, and he was brutal. He repressed the Jews. He was very violent. He took extreme action against any opposition to him. He was a very oppressive ruler, and he loved a good bribe, as many oppressive rulers do. Money spoke to Governor Felix. Keep that in mind. It's part of our story today. And so we come to Acts chapter 24. 5 days later, after Paul had arrived, the high priest, Ananias, went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. We've enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. Can I just tell you, there's not an ounce of truth in that statement. Every piece of historical evidence we have from other sources tells us that it was not a time of peace. And no one's been able to find the reforms that are mentioned here. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a classic case of flattery. Because we have evidence from other sources as to what went on, and it's quite the contrary. They were buttering him up because they wanted a good decision against this man, Paul. But in order not to weary you further, we would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. Another nice statement there. We're not going to take very long about this. We'll just give you a little bit of evidence, and then you can bring a quick decision against him. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He's a ringleader of the Nazarene sect and even tried to desecrate the temple. So we seized him. By examining him yourself, you'll be able to learn the truth about these charges we're bringing against him. The other Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. Notice, no witnesses called. This is a character assassination. He's a troublemaker. The Christian church is diminished by being called a sect, the Nazarene sect. Dismissive. He tried to desecrate the temple. What evidence have we got of that? None. Here are mere assertions against Paul. Rhetorical assertions, criticisms of his character to destroy his reputation. But no witnesses are called. Now, in the ancient world, the place of witnesses was less robust than it is today in the legal processes of the modern world. And rulers were more inclined towards emotional response or political expediency or, dare I say it, a bribe, perhaps, to deal with difficult situations. Verse 10, when the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, I know that for a number of years you've been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. Note that Paul doesn't say he did a good job as a judge over the nation. Unlike the opponents, he just acknowledged the fact. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogue or anywhere else in the city, and they cannot prove to you the charges that they are now making against me. In other words, where is the evidence? Where are the witnesses that he desecrated or did something disrespectful in the temple? It was quite the opposite. Verse 14, however, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way which they call a sect. Notice the difference. The Christians called their pathway in the very early days the way. Wasn't that a lovely expression? Some churches even today use the expression the church on the way. Whereas the Jews said it's a sect. I believe everything that's written in accordance with the law that is written in the prophets, and I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there'll be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. After an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings in the temple. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there were some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. Or these who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin, unless it was this one thing I shouted as I stood in their presence. It's concerning the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you today. So he points out that the witnesses who could be called have disappeared. They're not there. These are just mere assertions of the Jewish leaders. Paul had come to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts. He'd spent months gathering money from churches in other parts of the world, and he brought them to Jerusalem as a special gift, and we heard about that in earlier episodes. And so here is the situation being described. And by the way, this is written by an eyewitness. Luke, the writer, was almost certainly there, hence the detail. Now, what's the governor going to do? It's a tricky situation for him. Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias, the commander from Jerusalem, comes, he said, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, "Oh, that's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I'll send for you." At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. So he sent for him frequently and talked with him. Money talks. But there was no bribe. And then staggeringly, at the end of this chapter, the very last verse, when 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. But because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. 2 years. So what's going on with this Governor Felix? Here's an interesting case of somebody who knew about the Christian faith and it made them very uneasy. There are people you know and I know who know about the Christian faith and it makes them uneasy. They have two things going on within them, which we can see in Felix. They're drawn to the truth and they're scared of the truth. Because the truth has implications for them. How did he know about the Christian faith? First of all, his wife was a Jewess, so she may have known about Christianity herself. Secondly, in Caesarea, this lovely Roman town, peaceful town, military presence, plenty of temples to worship in this very town, there was already a church. We know from other parts of the book of Acts. And its leader was a fiery evangelist by the name of Philip. And if you've read the New Testament, you'll know that Philip the evangelist did amazing miracles and preached. He settled with his family and had 4 daughters, we find out in an earlier chapter, and they lived in Caesarea. So one of the best evangelists in the early church lived within a mile of Felix's house. That's tricky. That's really tricky. Because the church is probably growing there, under his nose. This is what often happens with oppressive autocratic regimes that don't acknowledge the Christian faith. The church grows under their very feet. This is exactly what's happening in China today, for example. And not only that, but 20 years earlier, a well-respected Roman centurion in Caesarea, part of the military unit stationed there by the name of Cornelius, started having visions from the divine God and angelic visitations and invited Peter to come up to Caesarea, right underneath the nose of the Roman authorities. And Peter preached the gospel to Cornelius and his household, and the Holy Spirit fell with such power that it was like the day of Pentecost. This happened within a mile or 2 of where we are now. And this would be remembered in Caesarea. Felix knew about the gospel. He knew about Jesus. And he was, in a sense, fascinated. Why did he keep calling Paul time and again? He was in prison there over a 2-year period that the text tells us. From time to time he said, "Bring me Paul. Let's have another conversation." Why? Why? 2 possible reasons. He wanted the bribe, but he must have realized fairly quickly he wasn't going to get a bribe, so there must be another reason. Why did he keep reaching out to Paul? Because something in him was stirring, that this was a true message, and he wanted to find out a bit more about it. But when he got close to the truth, he said, no, enough, Paul, off you go, back to prison. We actually see it happen once, described very clearly to us, and it probably happened many times. So here we have an example of a phenomenon, a reality, that many people are drawn to Christ, but held back by the cost to them of changing their lives. They know that a major change is coming. And for Felix, it was too much of a price, tragically. And so he never responded to this message. And illegally and unjustly, he kept Paul in prison for 2 whole years. This is a journey, folks, that, humanly speaking, went wrong. To Jerusalem, to Rome, it should have taken maybe 6 weeks or a couple of months to do all the work and all the travel, all the visits along the way. But 2 years he spent stuck in Caesarea, in prison. And sometimes we wonder, why are all these stories in the New Testament in such detail? Do you sometimes wonder that? Why are we told these things in such detail? What help are they for us? So as I conclude, I want to suggest some very practical things we can learn from this. First of all, notice that Paul was helped in prison for 2 years by his friends. They were allowed to visit him and bring him food and encouragement and anything that he needed practically. So who would those friends be who visited him? Well, there's a local church down the road. There's Philip the evangelist and his family and all those other people. They would have taken Paul on as an honorary church member because he was in prison just down the road. And they'd have prayed for him every Sunday. How encouraging would that be if you're in prison? And then there's people like Luke, who traveled with him to Judea on this long journey. Luke didn't live in the area. He wasn't Jewish. He didn't come from Judea. He was visiting the area. And he got stuck in the area because Paul was stuck in the area. So he would be visiting, and other friends that Paul had would be visiting. And here's a thought that I glean from this. Hebrews 13, verse 3 says, "Continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, or those who are mistreated, as if you yourselves were suffering." We can do the same thing. We can identify with somebody we know in prayer, in giving, in communication, who's suffering because of their faith. I would encourage us all. You can do that. It's an action point that we can take away from this text. The second thing that I note from this is how we deal with the frustrations of the dead-end circumstances that happen in life, where things are not going the way you expected them to go and you are stuck in a difficult situation. Anyone ever been in a situation like that? I think you know what I mean. It could be because of a health issue or medical issue or a job issue or a family issue. There could be all sorts of reasons why things don't go right in life. And it did not go right for Paul. 2 years in prison was a terrible thing for Paul. He was a hyperactivist. How did he survive 2 years in prison? We don't know. History doesn't tell us. He was a man who was always on the move. And yet now he's stuck in one place. And that's what happens to us sometimes in life. We're stuck in a place that we don't want to be. Can I suggest to you that God is at work just as strongly when we feel stuck as when we feel that everything's flowing freely? And can I give you a scenario of what may well have happened during this 2-year period? Luke is there in the country, almost certainly visiting Paul regularly. He didn't live in the country. He probably stayed in Caesarea with some of the church members. He didn't have any family. He wasn't a Jew. And he was Paul's traveling companion. What did he do during those 2 years? Here's a suggestion, a very likely thing that happened. We know that Luke, writing the gospel, based it on eyewitness evidence of the life of Jesus. This was the only time in his life that he was in the country, as far as we know, for 2 years. So probably Paul said, look, while we're here, why don't you get on with that writing project? Go over to Nazareth in Galilee, see some of the extended family of Jesus. Go to Jerusalem and some of the early church people. They're still around 20 years after the events. There's still quite a few of them there. Get their stories, write them all down. And why don't we write down the story of all the time we've spent together? And so, in that 2-year period, we have the book of Luke and the book of Acts being worked on. Because they're stuck there. Now, we can't prove this, but it's by far the most likely explanation of how we find Luke saying at the beginning of Luke, we were handed down to us from the first, the eyewitnesses of the word. With this in mind, I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, and I decided to write an orderly account. That's Luke's gospel. When did he do it? At this time. Even in the difficult, dead-end situations, we have to ask ourselves the question, what is God doing? It didn't work out as I wanted it to work out. But God has another purpose that he will make known to us if we're open to it. And I want us to reflect on that as we end this talk in just a minute. And another reflection. The troubled unbeliever like Felix. If you know someone like that, please pray for them. Pray that they will come through to salvation, because it often happens. I had a friend in business who was just like that. He'd often sit down to me and talk, tell me about your faith. And then about halfway through the conversation, he said, enough, I don't want to hear any more. He was getting really agitated because at that time, his business life and his personal life didn't match up to the Christian gospel by a long margin. But every so often he'd say, come and talk to me. Let's go for a drink. Tell me more about your church or your faith. Just drawn in. So there are people who could come to faith as Felix could have come to faith. And I want to end this talk with just a final reflection on the idea of Paul being a witness. Paul always identified himself as a believer. And he did this very, very clearly by saying he was a follower of the way, a follower of Jesus. Now, there's something very significant in the Bible about this point, which I just want to reflect on. It's a very profound reality for us. The early Christians always used an early opportunity in talking to people to identify that they were believers. They didn't leave it until someone asked them the question 7 years later. They identified themselves. They gave witness to I go to church. I believe in Jesus. I have a faith. Something like that. Not a preach, but an identification. Do you know what I mean? There's a big difference. We're not here talking about preaching to people necessarily, but we're talking about identifying your faith. And the New Testament is very clear that God uses the people who, as it were, nail their colors to the mast. Even if they're ridiculed or ignored or it doesn't lead anywhere, God uses that process. And Paul would always say, I am a follower of the way, or a follower of Jesus. He'd make it clear, whatever the cost. And there can be a tendency in the modern Western church to be so low-key that you never actually make that statement to friends or work colleagues. And I want to encourage us to be on the front foot in terms of identifying your faith in a calm and quiet and friendly way as a witness. Because God can use it. And I'll end this talk with a story, and then we'll pray. About a month ago, a friend told me something which was an astonishing surprise to me. He said he had followed the journey of being very much a non-Christian to now being a strong believer. Very much a non-Christian. And he said, my first living encounter with Christianity was at a local Shrewsbury and Atcham Borough Council licensing meeting in the 1990s when I was a publican. I was owning a pub and I was coming to have my license renewed along with all my friends. And we were coming to the licensing subcommittee and you were there. Now, why was I there? I wasn't in the pub trade, just to clarify. I was there because a group of friends had decided to make a stand at the time, this was in the early 90s, against a particular shop in town that was selling high-level pornography. This was before the internet, and we were challenging the licensing of that shop, which we challenged successfully, as it happened, and it caused a big stir in the papers. Anyway, while I was debating this in the chamber with the councillors, this guy was in the background waiting for his pub license to come up. And all his mates were talking to him. But I only found this out a month ago, by the way. Saying, who is this religious nut here, this geezer here? We need to get this guy off. We need to get on with the real business, which is getting all our licenses renewed. And of course, they were all nervous because the police reports and violence and drug incidents and all that stuff was coming up. And were they going to get their renewals? Were the police going to say, no, you can't have this one because of the state of the pub, So they were all there. And I could hear all this muttering going on in the background. I remember it now, thinking I'm probably not very popular here, but I didn't know who these guys were. And anyway, we finished our item and the vote went our way, and it's a bit of a hoo-ha, and then it went quiet, and then all their licenses came up. And he got his license, and he said, I took note of you then, because I was a total unbeliever, but I was a seeker, secretly. And I didn't know where to look. And so he looked me up, and he looked up our church, and eventually found his way to hear the gospel. And about 4 years later, he became a believer. His journey's taken him elsewhere now, but he's still a strong believer. And he never, I've known him all these decades, he never, ever, ever told me that fact until a month ago. And it happened purely by accident. I said, you serious? Witness. Just stand up. Just be yourself. Just be authentic in the playground, in the workplace. When there's a tax avoidance thing just coming up in the business. When there's a bit of malpractice going on in the medical situation, you think, hang on, we probably need to do this a bit differently. Be authentic. And you never know what God will do. And that's what Paul did here. He had no idea what was going to happen. And he spent 2 years in jail after that. But then suddenly got set free, and he ended up in Rome, and all sorts of amazing miracles happened, and that's another story for another day. Let's stand together.